What if the very heroes who had saved countless lives suddenly needed saving themselves? Two German shepherds, celebrated as legends in their town, collapsed at the doorstep of a lonely war veteran. He was broken, haunted by PTSD, and had locked the world away. But that night, as he chose to open his heart, he discovered something more powerful than survival. He discovered hope. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Snow fell heavily over the Alaskan wilderness, turning the forest into a silent cathedral of white. The sky was gray, the air biting, and the wind whistled through the pines as if carrying voices from another world. Michael Harris sat hunched in his chair inside a lonely wooden house that he had built with his own hands decades earlier, when his life had still carried a sense of direction. Now 55, Michael bore the weathered look of a man who had lived too long in the shadows of his own memories. His frame was tall but slightly stooped, the years and his burdens pulling at his shoulders. His hair, once a deep brown, had surrendered to gray at the temples, cropped short in a soldier's style he never abandoned. A trimmed beard of salt and pepper clung to his jawline, emphasizing his angular face. His hazel eyes, though sharp once, now often appeared distant, as though staring at something only he could see. Ghosts of war, images of fire and smoke. Michael had served for 20 years in the U.S. Army, his service spanning deployments in arid deserts and broken cities, where he had faced not just the enemy, but also the slow erosion of trust in humanity. His comrades remembered him as stoic, steady under fire, but what they did not see was the storm building inside. The event that had broken him beyond repair had not been the loss of fellow soldiers, though that pain was immense, but the death of his K-9 partner, Hunter. Hunter had been a sable German shepherd, intelligent and fiercely loyal. In one chaotic mission, Hunter detected a hidden device too late, throwing his body toward Michael just as the explosion ripped through the street. The blast had scarred Michael's hands and left his ears ringing for months, but it had been Hunter's lifeless body lying in the dust that shattered him. That night never left him. Even now, in the stillness of his isolated home, the roar of explosions replayed in his head, shaking him from sleep. He would wake drenched in sweat, hearing the phantom bark of his dog, the metallic clang of rifles, the wails of injured comrades. PTSD was not something he spoke of. It lived in his muscles, in the way he startled at loud noises, in the cautious way he moved, as though the world could betray him at any moment. His home was a reflection of his inner world. The wooden house was modest but sturdy, its walls lined with shelves of old books and a few medals in dusty frames, tokens of a life that felt like someone else's. The fireplace was the heart of the house, casting a dim orange glow that kept the cold from seeping into his bones. A single wooden table stood near the window, bearing an untouched mug of tea that had long since cooled. Outside, the blizzard swirled, flakes clinging to the frosted window panes, obscuring any view of the vast forest beyond. The place was functional, not warm, much like the man himself. Michael rarely ventured into the nearby town. He preferred solitude to the polite but pitying glances of strangers who knew him only as that veteran. People respected his service, but pity weighed heavier than bullets. He had grown tired of well-meaning words that could never understand the silence inside him. Once in a while, he drove his old pickup to buy supplies, flour, dried meat, kerosene, but he spoke little, his voice gravelly from disuse. In truth, he feared connection. Connection meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant loss. On this night, as the fire crackled softly, Michael leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, watching the flames dance. He often found himself staring into fire, searching for answers that never came. Flames reminded him of both life and destruction, of campfires with comrades and of cities burning. He picked up the mug of tea, hands trembling slightly, then set it down without drinking. His stomach was knotted, his mind restless. The storm outside beat against the walls, each gust echoing like the shock waves of detonations. His thoughts circled endlessly. He wondered why he was still here when so many had not made it back. Survivor's guilt was a cruel companion. He thought of Hunter again, the German shepherd who had died so that he could live. Did a man deserve peace when his dog had given everything? Michael clenched his fists, staring at the scarred knuckles, remembering how he had dug through rubble with bare hands trying to reach the body, refusing to leave him behind. Time in the wilderness had not healed him. The silence sometimes made the voices louder, the absence of people amplifying the memories of those long gone. Yet, he chose it deliberately. He wanted no witnesses to his weakness, no one to see a soldier crumble under the weight of nightmares. He imagined sometimes that he could disappear out here, and no one would notice until spring thaw revealed his absence. Still, there was a resilience in him, though buried. He kept his home orderly, chopping wood each morning, tending to a small greenhouse where hardy vegetables grew under the weak light of a lamp. These rituals gave him purpose, however small. Routine was the soldier's friend, even long after the uniform had been hung away. But routines could not silence the loneliness that grew heavier with each year. Michael had moments when he tried to recall who he was before the war. He remembered faintly a younger man with laughter, with hopes of family, but those memories felt like they belonged to a stranger. Now he was simply Michael Harris, 55 years old, a man defined not by who he was, but by what he had lost. As the night deepened, he rose slowly, joints aching, and placed another log into the fireplace. Sparks rose, then settled, the flames burning steady. He gazed into them until his eyes watered, his mind drifting between exhaustion and memory. He whispered Hunter's name, barely audible, as if afraid to break the silence. The sound of his own voice startled him. It was rare he spoke aloud anymore. The storm outside roared louder, pressing against the windows, rattling the wooden frame of the house. Michael felt a shiver despite the fire. He pulled his coat tighter around him and returned to his chair, pressing his palms together, head bowed. He thought of death, not with fear, but with the strange calm of a man who had walked its edge too many times. But even in that dark contemplation, some small ember within him refused to go out. That ember was tied to Hunter, to loyalty, to the idea that perhaps sacrifice had to mean something. The night carried on in silence, save for the storm and the crackle of wood. Michael sat unmoving, his eyes heavy, drifting between waking and dreams. He wondered, as he often did, how long a man could live like this, alone, haunted, waiting for something he could not name. He did not yet know that the storm was not the only force moving toward him that night, and that soon, the knock at his door would change everything. The storm raged with merciless fury, snow slashing sideways across the blackness of the Alaskan night, the wind howling like artillery across the treetops. Inside his wooden house, Michael Harris sat rigid in his chair, every gust rattling the windows, dragging him back to the battlefield. The pounding of the gale sounded like mortars, each snap of branches outside like gunfire, and his chest grew tight, as if invisible hands were pressing down. He closed his eyes, willing the noise to fade, but his mind betrayed him, replaying explosions and screams, the haunting bark of his fallen K9, Hunter. His breathing grew shallow. He pressed his palms hard against his temples and muttered through clenched teeth, "Not again." He rocked slightly in his chair, a habit from combat days when movement meant survival. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing weak light across the walls, but even the warmth of the flames could not shield him from the cold grip of memory. Then it came, the sound that did not belong to the storm, a faint scratching, almost tentative, against the wooden door. Michael froze. His heart hammered against his ribs, and his mind scrambled for explanation. Another branch? An animal? Then came a soft whine, long and trembling, cutting through the storm like a plea. Michael's breath caught. For a moment, he thought his broken mind was playing tricks, offering phantom noises to torment him. But no, the sound came again, firmer this time, claws against wood, accompanied by a muffled bark that lacked aggression. Michael rose slowly from his chair, knees stiff, every muscle tensed with suspicion. He reached instinctively for the rifle propped against the wall, an old habit never abandoned. Moving to the frosted window, he wiped away condensation with the edge of his sleeve and peered out into the blizzard. The lantern glow from inside barely pierced the swirling snow, but then two shapes emerged from the chaos. His chest tightened as he focused. There, huddled against the porch, were two German shepherds. The first was large and broad-shouldered, its fur a thick coat of black and brown, dusted white with snowflakes. Its head was lowered, but its eyes lifted to meet his, glowing faintly in the dark. The second, smaller, with a coat of warm golden tan, leaned weakly against the other, ribs faintly visible beneath its fur, its eyes hollowed by exhaustion. Neither bared teeth, neither growled. Their bodies trembled, not with rage, but with cold. They were survivors, barely holding on. Michael's hand gripped the windowsill as though to steady himself. His throat constricted. For a fleeting moment, he saw Hunter standing there, alive, waiting for him to open the door. The resemblance was cruel. He stepped back, shaking his head. His rational mind screamed, "They are wild. They could turn. They could kill you inside your own home." But another voice, quieter and deeper, whispered, "They came here because they had no choice, just like you once did." The scratching came again, weaker now, a faint whimper that cut deeper than any shell burst ever had. Michael lowered the rifle. He moved to the door, every step measured, every nerve taut. He hesitated at the handle, staring at the wood as though it were the gate between two worlds, one of solitude, the other of responsibility. His pulse thundered in his ears. He inhaled sharply, muttered a prayer he had not spoken since the war, and pulled the door open. The storm roared into the house, a wave of snow and wind biting his face. The two dogs recoiled slightly at the sudden burst of light and warmth, but the larger one, the black and brown, stepped forward cautiously, paws sinking into the drifted snow at the threshold. Its eyes, deep amber, locked on Michael's with an intensity that was not wild but pleading. The smaller golden tan whimpered and stumbled forward, collapsing half into the doorway, its body trembling violently. Michael dropped to one knee without thinking, his instinct overriding fear. He reached out a weathered hand, scars still lining his knuckles. The larger dog tensed but did not retreat. Instead, it pressed closer, nudging the smaller one toward him. Michael's throat tightened. One was protecting the other, as soldiers would. He whispered hoarsely, "You're not here to harm me, are you?" The golden tan dog whined softly, eyes fluttering shut in exhaustion. Decision came like the pulling of a trigger. He opened the door wider, gestured inside, and both dogs stumbled across the threshold, their paws leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. Michael shut the door quickly, shutting out the howl of the storm, and for a moment, silence reigned. The two German shepherds stood trembling in the cabin, steam rising from their damp coats as heat from the fire reached them. Michael studied them. The larger, strong though gaunt, carried himself like a guardian, standing close to its companion, head lifted, eyes watchful. The smaller was clearly weaker, sides heaving with labored breaths, paws raw from the ice, a faint limp in its back leg. Their loyalty to one another was undeniable, the way they leaned into each other, refusing to be parted. Michael's heart twisted. This bond mirrored his own with Hunter. He fetched an old blanket from a chest and laid it near the fire. With hesitation, the larger dog nudged the smaller onto it before curling halfway around in a protective arc. Michael found himself moving automatically, setting another log onto the fire, boiling water in a small pot, then tearing strips of dried meat from his stores. He soaked them in the warm broth to soften them, set the dish on the floor, and stepped back. The larger dog sniffed cautiously, then ate quickly, glancing at Michael as though half expecting the food to be taken away. The smaller lifted its head weakly, licked once, then pressed its muzzle back down, too tired to eat. Michael crouched near, dipping his fingers into the warm broth, bringing it gently to the dog's mouth. Slowly, the golden tan shepherd lapped it up, eyes fluttering open with gratitude before closing again. A lump formed in Michael's throat. He shook his head and muttered, "Damn it, I didn't ask for this." But his hands continued, steady and practiced, as though remembering how he once cared for Hunter after long marches. He gently lifted the smaller dog's paw, inspecting the cracked pads, wiping them clean with a damp cloth. The dog flinched but did not resist. He wrapped a strip of cloth around the sore limb, his touch firm but tender. The larger dog watched every move, ears alert, but did not interfere. It simply lowered its head beside its companion and exhaled heavily, a sound of relief more than suspicion. Michael leaned back against the wall, his breath heavy. His chest ached with emotions he had buried deep. Compassion, responsibility, the echo of partnership. He stared at the two creatures now curled near his fire, two strangers that had sought him out of all the homes in the wilderness. He wondered if fate had sent them, or if it was punishment, reminding him of Hunter's sacrifice. The storm still raged outside, the wind shrieking, but inside there was only the crackle of fire and the slow, rhythmic breaths of two German shepherds fighting their way back from the edge. For the first time in years, Michael's cabin did not feel empty. For the first time in years, he was not entirely alone. And though he would not admit it even to himself, a flicker of warmth had begun to burn inside him, not just from the fire, but from the silent presence of the two lives now resting under his roof. Michael Harris stood rigid by the doorway, the wooden handle still warm beneath his palm from where he had pulled it open. The storm pressed against the walls of the cabin, its fury muffled now by the door shut behind him. But inside, the silence was broken by the heavy breathing of the two German shepherds who had just crossed the threshold. The larger of the pair, Ranger, with his dark brown and black coat, stood for only a heartbeat before collapsing in a controlled sprawl onto the floorboards. His chest rose and fell like a bellows, steam rising from his fur as heat from the fire reached him. Beside him, Scout, the smaller golden-tan shepherd, stumbled forward, paws slipping on the wooden planks, before he too sank down, his body trembling with exhaustion. Both animals panted heavily, their breath fogging the air before dissolving into the warmth. Michael remained where he was, torn between instinct and compassion. His training whispered to him of dangers, of wildness in animals, of risks he had no business entertaining. Yet another voice, one that sounded very much like Hunter's, reminded him of loyalty, of trust, of the times when a German shepherd had saved his life. He set the rifle back against the wall, though not out of reach, and knelt slowly beside the dogs. Ranger lifted his head just enough to meet Michael's eyes. There was no aggression, only exhaustion and a guarded watchfulness, as though he were assessing this human the way soldiers assessed allies in foreign terrain. Scout, barely conscious, let out a soft whimper, curling closer to the larger dog. Michael felt the muscles in his chest tighten with something dangerously close to tenderness. He exhaled slowly, then muttered, "All right then." "You're in?" He moved to the hearth, tossing another log onto the flames, coaxing the fire to grow stronger. The crackle of wood and the flare of sparks filled the space with warmth and light. The dog shifted closer to the blaze, drawn to its heat as if it were life itself. Their damp coats began to steam, sending the scent of wet fur into the room. Michael grimaced faintly. He had never cared for animals since Hunter's death, but here he was, attending to two strangers as though compelled by something beyond choice. He fetched a pan from the shelf and filled it with water, setting it down before the pair. Ranger rose onto unsteady legs and drank deeply, his large tongue lapping noisily. Scout managed a few weak laps before resting his muzzle back onto the blanket Michael had hastily laid out. The veteran studied them carefully, noting the raw pads of their paws, the thinness around their ribs, the way Scout's left leg trembled when he shifted weight. These dogs had been traveling far, perhaps days, through the storm. Michael's thoughts drifted unwillingly to a memory of Afghanistan, years earlier. There had been a boy, Ali, skinny, dark-eyed, who had guided Michael's squad through a village. The boy had carried a stray puppy with him, insisting it was good luck. When the firefight broke out hours later, Michael remembered seeing the boy shielding that small dog even as bullets tore through the air. It struck him now, the same way. Ranger protecting Scout, unwilling to leave him even at the edge of collapse. He rubbed a hand over his beard, muttering, "Brotherhood. Doesn't matter if it's men or beasts, does it?" The storm outside showed no signs of abating. Snow hissed against the shutters, and the cabin creaked under the weight of wind. Michael resigned himself to the truth. These animals would not survive if turned back out. He rummaged through his supplies, pulling down a bag of dried venison he had planned to stretch over weeks. He cut a few strips, softened them in broth, and placed them on a plate near the fire. Ranger approached cautiously, giving Michael a long, evaluating look before eating. Scout only managed to nibble, his eyes half closed, but even that seemed to restore a flicker of strength. Michael leaned against the wall, watching them. He thought of how long it had been since another heartbeat filled this house besides his own. For years it had been silence, punctuated only by his nightmares. Now there were two more lives, fragile but real, filling the air with breath and warmth. Against his will, the emptiness inside him shifted slightly. Later, he retrieved an old tin trunk from beneath his bed, rummaging through until he found bandages and a bottle of antiseptic left from his army days. He returned to the hearth and gently lifted Scout's paw, examining the cracked pads and the faint swelling around the joint. The dog flinched, whining, but did not pull away. Michael spoke in low tones, steady and soft, the same voice he had once used to calm Hunter under fire. "Easy there, nothing to fear." He cleaned the wound, applied ointment, and wrapped the paw in cloth. Ranger watched every move, ears perked, body tense, but never interfered. When Michael finished, Ranger gave a single soft huff, almost as if approving. As the hours passed, the fire dimmed and was fed again. Michael sat back in his chair, exhaustion creeping into his bones, yet his eyes never left the two animals. Ranger curled protectively around Scout, their bodies rising and falling in unison, their faces calm now in sleep. Michael listened to the rhythm of their breathing. It reminded him of nights in the barracks when comrades slept around him, when the presence of others meant he was not alone. He caught his reflection in the window, a gaunt, gray-haired soldier sitting among ghosts, and now, perhaps, guardians of flesh and blood. He shook his head with a tired laugh. "Guests uninvited," he whispered, "but maybe, just maybe, needed." Outside, the storm raged on, but within those walls, life had returned. Michael leaned back, eyes closing, the warmth of the fire and the companionship of two exhausted warriors finally lulling him towards something, like peace. The storm had not eased. If anything, it had grown heavier, snow slamming against the shutters and seeping cold through every crack of the wooden house. Inside, however, the fire burned brighter, and for the first time in many years, Michael Harris was not entirely alone. He moved awkwardly about his kitchen corner, pulling down a battered pot and filling it with snow scooped hastily from a bucket by the door. As the ice melted and bubbled over the fire, he tore strips of dried venison and dropped them in, stirring with a wooden spoon. His movements were stiff, not out of reluctance, but because he had almost forgotten what it felt like to prepare food for someone other than himself. The two German shepherds watched him closely. Ranger, the larger dog with the dark brown and black coat, had risen to a seated position, ears pricked, amber eyes following every motion like a sentinel guarding a comrade. Scout, the smaller golden tan dog, still lay on the blanket near the fire, sides heaving with each breath, but his gaze flickered between Michael and the pot with weary curiosity. When Michael finally set the steaming bowl on the floor and stepped back, Ranger moved forward, sniffed once, then began to eat in quick, hungry bites, though never tearing his eyes fully away from Michael. Scout, after some hesitation, lifted himself shakily and nibbled slowly, his body trembling with effort. Michael crouched beside him, frowning as he noticed how Scout winced each time he shifted weight onto his left hind leg. Without speaking, he retrieved an old tin basin, filled it with warm water, and returned. He set it down and gently lifted Scout's paw. The dog flinched, a weak growl rising in his throat, but when Michael met his eyes, dark pools of pain and trust, the sound died away. Michael carefully washed the swollen limb, rinsing away grit and ice, then patted it dry with a clean rag and bound it with cloth strips he tore from an old shirt. Ranger leaned in, watching every motion, tail twitching once but no protest leaving him. When Michael tied the knot firmly, Ranger released a soft exhale, as if satisfied. It struck Michael how absurd the scene was. A man who had sworn never to open his heart again, now tending to two strangers, treating them as he had once treated Hunter after long marches in foreign deserts. He muttered, "Don't get used to this." But the tremor in his voice betrayed a different truth. Hours passed, the fire dimmed and was fed again. Outside, the wind screamed, but inside, the rhythm of life shifted. Ranger eventually left the food and positioned himself near the door, head raised, body stiff like a soldier on watch. Scout curled closer to the fire, his breathing slowing, a low sigh escaping as he rested his head on the blanket. Michael lowered himself into his chair, exhaustion dragging at his bones, but for once the emptiness did not feel oppressive. When the storm cracked a branch outside with a sharp report, Michael jerked, upright, heart hammering. His vision blurred with memory, explosions, shouts, the deafening chaos of war. His body trembled, fists clenching, and his breath came fast and shallow. Before panic could consume him, a warm weight pressed against his hand. Scout had lifted his head and laid it gently across Michael's trembling palm. The touch was light but grounding. His frantic breathing slowed. He blinked, meeting the dog's eyes. Tired, yes, but steady, calm, anchoring him to the present. Across the room, Ranger remained at his post, body tense, ears swiveling to catch the storm's every noise. The sight of the two, the protector and the comforter, struck Michael with the force of revelation. In them, he saw not just animals seeking shelter, but roles he had once known among men, the comrade who shielded others, the comrade who steadied a soldier breaking inside. Michael leaned back in his chair, letting Scout's head rest against him. The firelight flickered across the scars of his hands, across the silver in his beard, across the lines of grief carved into his face. For years, he had lived in silence, letting the world believe he preferred it. But now, with one dog guarding his door and another anchoring his hand, he felt something he had not dared to hope for. The faintest flicker of belonging. The night dragged on, but for Michael, it passed differently than usual. Instead of battling nightmares alone, he drifted into uneasy sleep with the sound of steady canine breathing beside him. The storm still raged outside, but inside there was warmth, companionship, and a fragile thread of trust binding three survivors together. Morning crept slowly into the forest, the storm finally retreating after a night of unrelenting fury. Pale sunlight filtered weakly through heavy clouds, turning the snowdrifts outside into a glistening ocean of white. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, but its embers still glowed, throwing a faint orange hue across the wooden walls. Michael Harris stirred from a light and fractured sleep, his joints stiff from the chair he had slumped in. For a moment, he forgot the previous night, until his eyes fell on the two German shepherds still present, as if they had always belonged there. Ranger sprawled near the door, his massive frame coiled but alert even in sleep, and Scout curled on the blanket by the fire, breathing slow and steady. Michael rose, stretched, and rubbed at his beard. Something inside felt strangely different, not healed but less hollow. He had not heard the silence that usually haunted his mornings. Instead, the steady rhythm of canine breathing filled the cabin. He allowed himself a moment to simply stand and look at them before turning to stoke the fire. The scrape of metal against wood startled Ranger, who instantly lifted his head, ears erect, eyes sharp. When he recognized the man, his muscles relaxed slightly, though his watchfulness never faded. The sound that came next was not from inside, but from beyond the cabin walls. A muffled crunch of footsteps over snow. Michael stiffened, instinct sharp, his soldier's reflexes igniting. Few people ventured this deep into the forest, and fewer still after a storm. He reached for the rifle leaning against the wall just as a firm knock rattled the door. Michael hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the dogs. Ranger stood fully now, hackles half raised, while Scout struggled to his feet with a low whine, favoring his bandaged leg. Another knock, followed by a woman's voice, carried through the wood. "Hello? Is anyone here? I'm with the Fairbanks Rescue Unit." Michael's grip on the rifle eased, though his body remained taut with caution. Slowly he unlatched the door and opened it a crack. Outside stood a woman bundled in a thick red parka, snow crusted along the seams. She pulled back her hood, revealing a face framed by auburn hair that tumbled in damp strands across her shoulders. Her skin was pale, touched with the rawness of cold, and her green eyes were wide with exhaustion, but alive with determination. "I'm Kara Mitchell," she said, her voice steady despite the fatigue written across her features. "Search and rescue. We've been looking for two missing K9s since the storm hit. I tracked their prints this way." Michael opened the door wider, the rifle still hanging loosely by his side. "You'd better come in," he muttered. She stepped inside, stomping snow from her boots. Kara was in her early 30s, tall and lean, with the build of someone accustomed to long hikes and sleepless nights. Her hands were reddened from cold, calloused from work, and her face carried lines of someone older than her years, a woman who had seen enough grief to strip away illusions. The moment her gaze fell on Ranger and Scout, her composure fractured. "Oh, God!" Her hand flew to her mouth, and tears filled her eyes. She dropped to her knees, reaching for the golden-tan Scout, who whimpered softly and wagged his tail in weak recognition. "Scout? Ranger?" Her voice broke. "You're alive." The larger dog padded cautiously closer, sniffing at her gloved hand before nudging his head against her shoulder. Kara pressed her face into his fur, laughing through tears. "We thought we'd lost you." The whole town. Everyone feared the worst. Michael stood back, arms folded, uncertain what to do with the swell of emotion filling his cabin. He felt like an intruder in his own home, yet also strangely proud, as though he had played a part in something far larger than himself. Kara rose to her feet, blinking away moisture. She turned to Michael, her eyes shining. Without hesitation, she took his rough, scarred hand in hers. "You saved them. Do you understand what you've done? These aren't just dogs. They're heroes. Ranger and Scout have rescued children lost in whiteouts, pulled stranded families from wrecked trucks, even found an elderly man buried in snow when everyone else had given up. When they went missing, people lost hope." Michael shifted uncomfortably, not used to such direct praise. "I didn't do much. They came to me." Kara shook her head firmly. "No. You opened your door. You gave them warmth, food, and care. That's more than most would risk. Without you, they wouldn't be standing here." The words hit him harder than he expected. For years he had convinced himself he was useless, a relic haunted by ghosts. Now, here was a stranger telling him he had saved what the town considered irreplaceable. His throat worked, but he found no answer. Kara, sensing his discomfort, softened her tone. "I'm sorry. I don't even know your name, Michael," he said quietly. "Michael Harris." Recognition flickered across her eyes. "You're the veteran, aren't you? I've heard the townsfolk mention you, said you live out here alone." She hesitated, choosing her words. "They said you didn't want company." Michael almost smiled, a tired twist of lips. "They weren't wrong." Ranger interrupted by stepping between them, as though reminding the humans that his presence still mattered. Kara knelt again, stroking the thick fur along his shoulders. "We trained them for years," she explained. "They're disciplined, but more than that, they care. They know when someone's in pain. That's why people call them the Angels of Fairbanks." Michael's gaze drifted to Scout, who had sunk back onto the blanket, resting his head with trust in his tired eyes. He swallowed hard, whispering more to himself than anyone. "Heroes." Kara glanced up at him, expression earnest. "Yes, and you've brought them back to us. Do you realize what that means? Families in this community, mothers, fathers, children, they sleep easier because of these two. You've given them back their guardians." Michael looked away, struggling to process the strange warmth rising in his chest. He had not been thanked for anything in years, not sincerely. The thought that his choice to open a door could ripple outward to so many lives was almost unbearable. For a man who had lived buried under the weight of survivors' guilt, it was as if someone had placed a key in his hand and shown him that he still mattered. Kara stepped closer, her voice softer now. "You didn't just save 2 dogs last night. You saved hope." Michael met her eyes, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe she might be right. The morning sun had barely risen above the jagged peaks when the sky shifted again, gray clouds thickening like advancing armies across the horizon. Michael Harris had hoped for a reprieve, some hours to regain strength and plan their departure. Kara Mitchell, standing by the frosted window, adjusted the strap of her parka and said with cautious relief, "If the weather holds, I can radio for a snowmobile team to meet us halfway." Her voice carried a professional steadiness, but her green eyes flickered with concern. She had worked too many rescue missions to trust the mountains for long. Michael glanced toward the 2 German shepherds. Ranger, the dark-coated sentinel, stood alert near the door, sniffing the air as though he sensed the storm's return before the humans did. Scout, golden tan and still weak, lay on the blanket, his bandaged legs stretched awkwardly, his breathing heavy with strain. Michael knelt beside him, checking the wrap. His scarred hands worked with surprising gentleness. and though Scout winced, he pressed his muzzle lightly against Michael's wrist, as if acknowledging the care. The wind picked up suddenly, rattling the shutters with a force that made the wooden walls tremble. Kara stiffened. "No," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone. "It's too soon." Within the hour, the storm struck. Snow whipped sideways, the sky darkening until day resembled twilight. The cabin groaned under the assault, snow piling against the door, icy drafts finding every crack. Michael grabbed extra logs and stacked them by the hearth, his movements brisk. His chest tightened at the crashing noises outside, sharp cracks of falling branches echoing like gunfire. The familiar sound dragged him toward the battlefield, buried deep in his memory. His hands trembled as he reached for the poker, his breath shallow, his vision blurring. Ranger moved first, padding close, pressing his sturdy frame against Michael's side. The dog's amber eyes met his, steady and unwavering. That gaze, loyal and grounding, pulled Michael back from the precipice of panic. He exhaled slowly, gripping Ranger's fur, whispering, "I'm still here. With you." Scout whimpered, shifting on the blanket, his leg twitching in pain. Michael tore an old wool quilt into strips, heated water in a small pot, and soaked a cloth before pressing it gently against the swelling. The golden shepherd sighed, leaning into the warmth. Kara knelt beside them, pulling off her gloves to help. Her long fingers were quick and practiced, surprising Michael. "You've done this before," he noted. She gave a faint smile. "Rescue work isn't just pulling people from snowbanks. We tend to the injured until help arrives. Animals, too, when we find them." She paused, her expression shadowed. "Years ago, I had a dog, Lacey, a husky. She saved my life in a whiteout, kept me warm until another team found us. She didn't survive the following winter. Her voice, caught, but she steadied it. Since then, I've never turned away an animal in need." Michael studied her, recognizing in Kara the same quiet grief he carried. She was younger, but loss had carved its mark into her posture, into the determination hardening her features. She was not just a rescuer. She was someone who had been rescued, someone who carried both gratitude and sorrow. Outside, the wind screamed louder, forcing the two humans and two dogs into closer quarters. Ranger paced once before positioning himself directly at the door, his body a barrier, ears pricked. Scout dozed fitfully, his head resting against Michael's boot. Kara wrapped another quilt around them all, creating a small island of warmth in the flickering firelight. Hours passed like this, the storm unrelenting. The roof creaked under the weight of accumulating snow, and once, a violent gust nearly ripped a shutter free. Michael and Kara scrambled to reinforce it, hammering nails into old wood while Ranger barked sharply at each crash. When they returned to the fire, sweat freezing on their brows, Michael collapsed into his chair, his body aching. Kara sat opposite, her auburn hair damp with melted snow, strands clinging to her cheeks. For a while, neither spoke, only listened to the relentless roar outside. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "Why risk your life for them?" he asked, gesturing to Ranger and Scout. "They're just dogs." Kara's gaze hardened, though her voice remained calm. "They're not just dogs. They've saved children, guided families out of storms, found the lost when everyone else had given up. These two, Ranger and Scout, are the reason some people are alive today. And last night, you added yourself to that chain. You kept them alive. You're part of their story." Now Michael looked down, his chest tight. For years he had believed his story ended on a battlefield, a broken man spared by his dog's sacrifice. Now, here was someone telling him he had a new chapter to write. Ranger, still standing guard, turned his head, locking eyes with Michael as if to agree. The night dragged on, each hour a battle against the storm. Michael felt PTSD claw at him again whenever the wind cracked too loud. But each time, Ranger pressed closer, Scout shifted against his leg, or Kara laid a steadying hand on his shoulder. He endured, clinging to those small anchors. By dawn, the storm began to weaken. Light seeped back into the sky, pale but steady. The cabin still stood, battered but unbroken, and inside, 4 souls had weathered the night together. Michael, slumped in his chair, felt exhaustion heavier than armor, but also something new. resilience. He looked at Ranger and Scout, then at Kara, and realized that for the first time in years, he had not faced the darkness alone. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt almost holy. The snowfields stretched endlessly in every direction, glittering under a weak sun that pierced through the parting clouds. The world looked transformed, bright, pristine, yet still unforgiving. Michael Harris stood outside the cabin, his boots sinking into the fresh powder as he inhaled the sharp, clean air. The house behind him bore the scars of the blizzard, shutters cracked, roof sagging under ice. But it had held. For a man who had lived so long in solitude, that little house had been a fortress. Now it felt less like a cage and more like a marker of change, because he would not be leaving it alone. Kara Mitchell stepped out with determined energy, her auburn hair tied back beneath her hood. Her parka was zipped high, her gloves worn but sturdy. She had shed the vulnerability Michael had glimpsed the night before. In its place was the sharp focus of a rescuer on a mission. She moved with efficiency, pulling a sled from behind the cabin where it had been stored for emergencies. It was a simple wooden frame reinforced with steel runners, worn but reliable. She spread thick wool blankets across it, tucking the corners in with care. Scout limped weakly toward the sled, guided by Michael's gentle hand on his collar. His golden tan coat gleamed faintly in the sunlight, though exhaustion still dragged at his every step. Michael crouched, lifting him carefully into the sled. The dog whimpered, then settled against the folded blankets, his ribs rising and falling steadily. Michael brushed a hand over his head, murmuring, "You'll be all right, boy." Ranger, by contrast, stood tall, his black and brown coat bristling in the cold. He paced beside the sled like a guard, occasionally sniffing the air, his amber eyes scanning the horizon. There was pride in his stance, a quiet dignity that made Michael think of the sergeants he had served under, men who had borne their own scars but never wavered in front of their troops. They set out slowly, the sled gliding behind them. Kara pulled at the harness first, but Michael, unwilling to let her shoulder the weight alone, walked beside her and took one of the reins. Together they moved forward, the crunch of boots and the soft whisper of runners breaking the silence. The forest was still heavy with snow, branches sagging, but shafts of sunlight speared through, creating a world of shadows and brilliance. After an hour, they reached the frozen creek that marked the first leg of the journey. The ice was solid, but the snow covering it was deceptive. Kara tested the surface with her boot, frowning. "We'll need to spread the weight." "One at a time," she said, her voice firm. Michael nodded, guiding the sled carefully while Ranger trotted across with ease, his paws light over the surface. Scout let out a faint whine, but stayed calm when Michael placed a reassuring hand on him. Halfway across, the ice groaned, a sound that sent a shiver up Michael's spine. For a moment his mind leapt back to the battlefield, to the sound of shifting rubble after an explosion, but Kara's voice cut through. "Steady. Don't stop. Just steady." Together they pressed on, reaching the far bank without incident. Michael exhaled hard, his breath pluming white. They paused briefly at a stand of pines to rest. Kara knelt, pulling a thermos from her pack and handing it to Michael. "Coffee. It's not much, but it helps." He accepted, the warmth seeping through the metal into his fingers. Kara's eyes studied him, his gaunt face, the silver in his beard, the way his gaze lingered on the dogs more than on her. "You remind me of someone," she said softly. Michael arched an eyebrow, but remained silent, sipping. Kara continued, "My father. He was a firefighter, strong as an oak, but after a building collapse killed 2 men under his command, he never came back the same. Lived, but not really. I swore I'd spend my life pulling people out of the dark, the way no one could pull him back." Michael listened, her words striking too close to his own truths. He saw in her not just a rescuer, but a mirror of his own pain. Different battlefield, same scars. He handed the thermos back, murmuring, "Sometimes the only thing that pulls you back is someone, or something, you don't expect." His eyes fell on Ranger and Scout, who rested side by side in the snow. The journey resumed. As they climbed toward the ridge overlooking the valley, the wind picked up, whispering across the peaks. Ranger pressed closer to Michael, occasionally brushing his side as if reminding him of his presence. Each touch anchored Michael to the present, drawing him away from the ghosts that usually haunted his steps. At the top of the ridge, they stopped. Below lay the faint outline of the town, smoke curling from chimneys, tiny specks of life against the endless white. Michael's chest tightened. He had avoided that place for years, unwilling to face the eyes of neighbors who saw him only as a broken soldier. Now he was walking back, not in shame, but with purpose. He looked down at Scout resting in the sled, then at Ranger standing proud beside him. His voice was low, but firm, carried away by the wind. I couldn't save Hunter. He gave his life for me, and I've carried that weight every day. But today I won't fail you. Not either of you. Kara glanced at him, hearing the conviction in his tone, and gave a small nod. Then let's bring them home. Together they descended the ridge, the town drawing nearer with each step, the sled cutting a clear path behind them. Ranger walked like a soldier on parade, Scout dozed in safety, and Michael felt, for the first time in decades, that he was not marching into exile, but into belonging. The town of Fairbanks had been waiting. Word traveled quickly in small communities, carried by radios, neighbors, and the relentless curiosity of those bound together by the wilderness. By the time Michael Harris and Kara Mitchell descended from the ridge, the air in the town was alive with anticipation. Smoke curled from chimneys, children pressed faces to frosted windows, and men and women gathered near the edge of the main street, their boots crunching in the snow as they looked toward the trail. The sled appeared first, gliding across the packed white road. Scout lay curled on thick blankets, his golden tan coat brushed and glinting faintly in the pale light. His head was lifted just enough to reveal alert eyes, though weariness lingered. Beside the sled, Ranger moved with the measured dignity of a soldier returning from war. His dark brown and black fur rippled with each stride, his ears pricked forward, tail steady. The crowd erupted with cries, voices breaking into laughter and sobs. "Ranger!" someone shouted. "Scout!" Children broke into runs before being caught by parents who themselves could not hold back tears. An older woman, wrapped in a heavy blue shawl, pressed her hands together and whispered, "Thank God, thank God." Her name was Mabel Turner, the widow of a miner whose grandson had once been found by Scout after wandering too far in a snowstorm. Her wrinkled face glowed with gratitude as she stepped closer. Kara raised a hand, steadying the crowd with her calm authority. She was tired, her auburn hair damp with sweat beneath her hood, but her green eyes shone with relief. "They're safe," she called. "They're alive." The townsfolk surged forward, careful not to frighten the dogs, though Ranger greeted them with measured tolerance, allowing hands to brush his back while keeping a protective eye on Scout. Michael trailed slightly behind, his tall frame casting a long shadow against the snow. His coat was frayed, his beard sprinkled with frost, and his hazel eyes flicked uneasily over the sea of faces. For years he had avoided this very street, unwilling to meet the pity or curiosity of neighbors. Now he found himself at its center, pulled not by choice but by the weight of what he had done. Sheriff Daniel Brooks was the first to step forward from the crowd. A broad man in his early 60s, Brooks carried the kind of authority that came not just from his badge, but from decades of service. His hair was silver and cropped close, his face lined but steady, his jaw marked with a scar from a car wreck years earlier when he had pulled 2 children from a burning truck. He approached Ranger and Scout, his weathered hand resting on Ranger's head. His voice, deep and steady, carried over the crowd. Fairbanks owes its life to these two. And now, to the man who brought them back. Michael stiffened as all eyes turned to him. He felt the old instinct to retreat, to fade into the background. But Ranger, as if sensing his unease, stepped back from the sheriff and pressed against Michael's leg, standing tall at his side. Scout lifted his head from the sled and let out a soft bark, the sound cutting through the silence. The crowd erupted again, this time their cheers directed at Michael. Kara moved closer, laying a hand on Michael's arm. Her touch was steady, her voice quiet but clear. "You didn't just save 2 dogs, Michael. You saved what they mean to us. You gave this town its guardians back. You reminded us that heroes can return, even when we think we've lost them." Michael swallowed hard, words caught in his throat. He looked at the faces around him, weathered men, weary mothers, laughing children, and realized many of them owed their safety to the very dogs leaning against him now. For the first time, he saw not pity in their eyes, but respect, even gratitude. He stood silently as the crowd swirled around, as people knelt to stroke Scout gently, as children pressed cold cheeks to Ranger's fur. In that moment, Michael felt a shift deep inside, as though a heavy stone he had carried for years had cracked. Ranger turned his head upward, meeting his gaze with eyes that seemed to speak. "We saved many lives, but you saved ours." By late afternoon, the celebration began to fade. The townsfolk escorted Ranger and Scout to the community center, where volunteers had prepared fresh bedding, food, and medical supplies. Kara organized the details with brisk authority, delegating tasks to younger rescuers and speaking with the sheriff about long-term care. Michael stood at the edge, unsure if his presence was still required until Kara crossed back to him. "You're welcome to join us," she said softly. "Or you can return home. But either way, don't think for a second that what you did will be forgotten." Michael nodded, his throat tight, and offered no answer. He turned back toward the trail leading into the forest, toward the cabin that had, for so long, been his prison. The walk was long, but he welcomed it, each crunch of snow under his boots giving him time to breathe. Ranger and Scout had remained behind in the town, surrounded by love and care, and for once Michael did not feel abandoned. He felt that he had delivered them to where they belonged. That evening, as he pushed open the door to his cabin, the silence inside wrapped around him. Yet it was not the crushing silence of before. It was peaceful, carrying with it the memory of companionship, of loyalty, of eyes that had trusted him. He set another log on the fire, leaned back in his chair, and whispered into the still air, "I have found my reason again." A faint smile touched his lips, the first true one in years. Snow still covers the valley, but for Michael Harris, the silence is no longer just war and loss. Now, it carries the memory of Ranger and Scout, standing by his side as the storms rage, and the reminder that true hope never fails. He opened the door to danger, but instead found salvation. Sometimes salvation comes quietly, in the courage of a weary soldier and the loyalty of two dogs who refuse to give up. Michael, Ranger, and Scout have proven that even long-held scars can be healed with compassion, trust, and faith. And in your own life, remember this: what feels broken may be where God is preparing to shine His light. May their stories remind you to hold on to kindness and hope, and may God's grace and protection be with you and your family now and forever. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because there's more stories of healing and light to come.